They swore to protect and serve. But somewhere along the way, something broke. These 7 men once wore the uniform of the United States military. Today they wear prison jumpsuits and serving life behind bars for crimes that shook their comrades and the nation. Before we dive in, do not forget to subscribe to this channel and turn on the notification bell icon to get notified on our next video. Case 1. Captain John M. Russell, the Clinic Massacre. Captain John M. Russell was no stranger to war. A career soldier, he had served his country for over 3 decades, completing 4 full deployments in some of the most grueling environments the U.S. military had to offer. But it was his 5th tour, back in Iraq in 2009, that would mark a catastrophic unraveling of a man pushed far beyond his limits. At 44 years old, Russell was a communications specialist assigned to the 54th Engineer Battalion, based in Bamberg, Germany. Though never known for being particularly outspoken, he had always carried out his duties. Yet beneath the surface something was breaking. Years of exposure to trauma, stress, and isolation had begun to erode his mental health. Fellow soldiers noticed troubling signs. He was withdrawn, increasingly paranoid, and seemed convinced that higher-ups were sabotaging his career. On May 11, 2009, Russell was taken by his commander to the Combat Stress Clinic at Camp Liberty in Baghdad after exhibiting suicidal behavior. That visit was supposed to be a turning point, a step toward healing. Instead, it became the prelude to a massacre. Reports later revealed that Russell felt humiliated by his treatment at the clinic. He believed the staff had mocked him and that his superiors would use the visit to end his military career. After being returned to his unit, he somehow managed to seize his escort's unsecured M16 rifle and a loaded magazine. Armed and enraged, he stole a vehicle and drove back to the clinic he had visited just hours earlier. What followed was a cold, calculated rampage inside the clinic, a place meant to provide refuge from the horrors of war. Russell opened fire with chilling precision, gunning down 5 fellow service members. Each of them had answered the call to serve, each from a different walk of life, and none of them saw it coming. The victims were Major Matthew P. Houseel, age 54, from Amarillo, Texas. A respected psychiatrist with the 55th Medical Company, Houseel was in Iraq as a civilian contractor supporting mental health services. A father of 7, he had devoted his life to healing others. A Navy Commander Charles K. Springle, age 52, from Wilmington, North Carolina. He was a clinical social worker also assigned to the 55th Medical Company. Known for his calm demeanor and dedication, Springle was a pillar in the military mental health community. Sergeant Christian E. Bueno Galdos, age 25, from Paterson, New Jersey. Assigned to the 3rd Battalion, 66th Armor Regiment, and 172nd Infantry Brigade out of Grafenwöhr, Germany. Bright, kind, and committed to helping others, he was a rising star in the Army. Specialist Jacob D. Barton, age 20, from Lenox, Missouri. A member of the 277th Engineer Company, 420th Engineer Brigade, based in Waco, Texas. Known for his sharp wit and steady hand, Barton had his entire life ahead of him. Private First Class Michael E. Yates, Jr., age 19, from Federalsburg, Maryland. Like Bueno Galdos, he served with the 3rd Battalion, 66th Armor Regiment. He was the youngest victim, barely into adulthood, with dreams of a military career that ended far too soon. The attack was over in moments, but the consequences were permanent. Russell was arrested shortly after the shooting without resistance. The investigation that followed painted a picture of a man descending into madness, consumed by the belief that he was being persecuted. He underwent multiple psychiatric evaluations. Defense attorneys argued he suffered from severe depression and post-traumatic stress disorder, and that he had lost touch with reality. But prosecutors pointed to the planning, the theft of the weapon, and the targeted nature of the attack as signs of cold premeditation. In 2013, after years of legal wrangling and testimonies from both medical experts and grieving families, Captain John M. Russell was found guilty of 5 counts of premeditated murder by a military jury. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The massacre at Camp Liberty sent shockwaves through the military. It was the deadliest act of soldier-on-soldier violence during the Iraq War. But more than that, it exposed a system stretched thin and failing to adequately care for those it sent into battle again and again. Case 2, Staff Sergeant Robert Bales, the Kandahar Massacre. Staff Sergeant Robert Bales was a 38-year-old Army veteran from Lake Tapps, Washington, with 4 combat deployments, 3 in Iraq and 1 in Afghanistan. Despite being considered an average soldier by his peers, Bales had a history of disciplinary issues, including a prior assault charge and financial troubles. In late 2011 he was deployed to a remote outpost in Kandahar province, Afghanistan. On March 11, 2012, Bales left his post at Camp Balambe without authorization, armed with an M4 rifle and a 9mm pistol. He entered the nearby villages of Al-Kozai and Najiban in the Panjwai district, where he methodically killed 16 Afghan civilians, including women and children, and wounded 6 others. Some victims were shot at close range, others were stabbed, and several bodies were set on fire. Among the dead were 11 members of one family, including 4 girls under the age of 6 and 4 boys aged 8 to 12. Bales returned to his base between attacks to reload and report his actions, telling a fellow soldier, "I just shot up some people." The massacre sparked international outrage and severely strained U.S.-Afghan relations. Afghan authorities demanded that Bales be tried in Afghanistan, but U.S. officials insisted on a court-martial in the United States. In June 2013, Bales pleaded guilty to 16 counts of premeditated murder to avoid the death penalty. During sentencing he expressed remorse, calling his actions an act of cowardice. However, survivors and victims' families were dissatisfied with the outcome, feeling that justice had not been fully served. On August 23, 2013, Bales was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He was also demoted to the rank of private, dishonorably discharged, and ordered to forfeit all pay and allowances. The Kandahar massacre remains one of the most heinous crimes committed by a U.S. soldier during the Afghanistan conflict, highlighting the profound psychological toll of war and the critical need for effective mental health support within the military. Case 3. Specialist Ryan G. Anderson, the Inside Enemy. Ryan G. Anderson was not the kind of soldier the Army expected to become a threat from within. Born in the early 1970s and raised in Everett, Washington, Anderson was a graduate of Washington State University and a trained tank crewman and Arabic linguist in the Washington State National Guard. But underneath the uniform was a man deeply conflicted. In 1999, Anderson converted to Islam, a decision that, by itself, did not raise concerns, until his personal beliefs began to drift toward extremism. By 2003, as the Iraq War raged and U.S. forces intensified operations overseas, Anderson's ideology had started to take a radical turn. Struggling with feelings of alienation, resentment, and what prosecutors later described as admiration for Islamic militants, Anderson began seeking out al-Qaeda operatives online. Unbeknownst to him, the individuals he was communicating with were not terrorists. They were undercover agents from the FBI and the U.S. Army Criminal Investigation Division. In a covert sting operation, Anderson was recorded during multiple interactions. In the videos, he appeared in Islamic attire and pledged loyalty to jihadist causes. More disturbingly, he offered detailed information about U.S. military weaknesses, tank vulnerabilities, and suggested strategies insurgents could use to kill American soldiers more effectively. He provided sketches, technical manuals, and confidential knowledge he had gained through his role in the military. Captured by hidden cameras and online transcripts, the evidence against Anderson was overwhelming. He was arrested in February 2004 at Fort Lewis, Washington, just days before his unit was scheduled to deploy to Iraq. His arrest shocked not only his fellow soldiers but the nation at large, raising deep concerns about internal threats and the growing reach of online radicalization. During his court-martial in 2004, Anderson's defense claimed he was merely curious, that he had no intention of following through with the betrayal. But the jury disagreed. The prosecution successfully argued that Anderson had taken concrete steps toward aiding the enemy, with full knowledge of the consequences. Anderson was convicted of 5 counts of attempting to provide aid to al-Qaeda. He was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole. Though spared the death penalty or a sentence without parole, his actions were condemned as a clear and deliberate betrayal of the oath he had taken as a soldier. Now imprisoned at the United States Disciplinary Barracks in Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, Specialist Ryan G. Anderson is remembered as one of the most chilling examples of how ideology, isolation, and access to sensitive information can combine into a dangerous cocktail of treason from within. Case 4. Senior Airman Andrew Paul Witt, the double homicide at Robins Air Force Base. Andrew Paul Witt was not the type of airman you'd expect to spark fear. At just 23 years old, he was stationed at Robins Air Force Base in Georgia, serving as a senior airman in the U.S. Air Force. On the surface he blended in, young, disciplined, seemingly ordinary. But beneath his quiet demeanor lay a storm of rage, paranoia, and rejection. What he did in the summer of 2004 would become one of the most shocking acts of violence on a U.S. military base in decades. Witt had developed a friendship with fellow airman Andrew Schleipzig and his wife Jamie. But their connection soured. After an incident involving Witt making an unwanted advance toward Jamie, the couple distanced themselves, deeply unsettling Witt. He became isolated, paranoid, and vengeful, believing that his career and social standing were under threat because of what he had done and how the Schleipzigs had reacted. On July 5, 2004, Witt snapped. He broke into the Schleipzig home through a window around 2 a.m., armed with a knife. Inside were Andrew, Jamie, and their friend Jason King, who was sleeping on the couch. Without warning, Witt launched into a brutal and frenzied attack. He stabbed Andrew Schleipzig, 25, and Jamie Schleipzig, 22, to death. He then turned on Jason King, stabbing him 15 times, leaving him for dead. Miraculously, King survived and would become the key witness in the case. After the murders, Witt fled and returned to his barracks, trying to clean the blood from his clothes and hands. But the cover-up didn't last. Military investigators quickly pieced together his movements and arrested him shortly after. The shockwaves of the murders were felt across the base and the Air Force community. This was not an act of combat or a stress-induced break from deployment. It was cold, calculated, personal. The betrayal of trust was profound. These were fellow airmen, part of the same tight-knit unit, and Witt had turned on them with lethal intent. Witt was charged with 2 counts of premeditated murder and 1 count of attempted premeditated murder. In 2005, he faced a court-martial and was sentenced to death, becoming the first airman since 1992 to receive a death sentence. The military jury concluded that the brutal nature of the attack and his clear intent to kill justified the harshest penalty. But the legal battle didn't end there. Years of appeals followed. In 2016, the Court of Appeals for the Armed Forces overturned his sentence, citing inadequate defense during the original trial. At his resentencing in 2020, prosecutors pushed again for the death penalty. But after extensive testimony, including accounts of Witt's troubled upbringing and mental health history, a new panel sentenced him instead to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Case 5. Sergeant William J. Kreutzer, Jr., the Fort Bragg sniper. On the morning of October 27, 1995, the crisp air at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, was pierced by a sound no soldier expects during peacetime, gunfire erupting from within their own ranks. It came from a hill overlooking the field where over 1,000 paratroopers of the elite 82nd Airborne Division had assembled for morning physical training. Hidden among the trees, crouched with a semi-automatic rifle fitted with a scope and extra ammunition, was one of their own, Sergeant William J. Kreutzer, Jr., a 26-year-old soldier whose mind had unraveled in plain sight, long before he pulled the trigger. Kreutzer, a member of Alpha Company, 2nd Battalion, 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment, was known as a quiet, somewhat withdrawn man who had struggled under the weight of military expectations. He had been exhibiting signs of psychological instability for years. Just a year before the shooting, Kreutzer had explicitly told his superiors and fellow soldiers that he was experiencing violent thoughts, including suicidal and homicidal ideation. He sought help through Army mental health services, even confessing during counseling that he was afraid he might kill someone. Despite these red flags, Kreutzer was returned to duty after being deemed not a threat. His mental health evaluations were logged and reviewed, but ultimately no long-term action was taken to restrict his access to weapons or to remove him from active status. That inaction would prove tragically fatal. In the early morning hours of October 27, 1995, Kreutzer positioned himself in a wooded area overlooking Tall Stadium. As his unit gathered below for formation and physical training, Kreutzer opened fire with an M16 rifle outfitted with a scope and multiple magazines. He fired more than 20 rounds into the crowd, striking soldiers at random in a deadly rampage that lasted less than 5 minutes. One officer, Major Stephen Badger, a respected leader and father, was killed instantly. 18 others were wounded, some severely, including soldiers who suffered chest wounds, shattered limbs, and lifelong trauma. Panic swept across the field as troops scrambled for cover. Kreutzer was quickly subdued by fellow soldiers who charged the hill and tackled him before he could reload. The aftermath of the attack sent shockwaves throughout the U.S. Army and the country. Survivors and families of the victims demanded answers. How could a soldier with a known history of mental illness and violent ideation be left armed and untreated? The incident forced the military to confront the flaws in its mental health screening processes and led to increased attention on the psychological well-being of service members, particularly in high-stress combat units. At his court-martial in 1996, Kreutzer was initially sentenced to death, the first death sentence handed down by the Army since 1961. However, in the years that followed, his defense team, supported by mental health experts, argued that he suffered from severe psychiatric disorders, including major depressive disorder and borderline personality disorder. They claimed these conditions impaired his ability to make rational decisions and were not adequately addressed by military clinicians. In 2009, after years of legal appeals, Kreutzer's death sentence was overturned, and he was re-sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He remains incarcerated at the United States Disciplinary Barracks in Fort Leavenworth. Case 6. Private Dwight Jeffrey Loving, the Texas Taxi Murders. In December 1988, Fort Hood soldier Private Dwight Jeffrey Loving, a 20-year-old private assigned to the 1st Cavalry Division, shocked the nation and his military community with a brutal and senseless killing spree that would become one of the most infamous military crimes in modern American history. Originally from Rochester, New York, Loving had only recently joined the Army, but his path quickly veered from military discipline to cold-blooded violence. On the night of December 11, 1988, Loving set out into the streets of Killeen, Texas, with a loaded pistol and a disturbing plan. According to his own confession, he wanted to rob taxi drivers and, if necessary, kill them to avoid getting caught. His actions were premeditated, methodical, and without mercy. His first victim was Christopher Fay, a 20-year-old private and part-time taxi driver also stationed at Fort Hood. Loving flagged down Fay's cab near the base and directed him to a secluded area. There he robbed him at gunpoint and forced him to lie on the ground. With no hesitation, Loving shot Fay in the back of the head, execution style, and left his body in a dark field. Just hours later, he hailed another cab driven by retired Army Sergeant Bobby Charbino, a 44-year-old Vietnam veteran and father of 3. As with Fay, Loving directed Charbino to an isolated stretch of road, robbed him, and shot him in the head, killing him instantly. Charbino's body was later found dumped near a dirt road. Still not finished, Loving targeted a third cab driver, Howard Harrison. After robbing him and attempting to kill him the same way, Loving fired his weapon but failed to deliver a fatal shot. Harrison, though seriously injured, miraculously survived and later testified against Loving. The sheer brutality of the crimes, random, premeditated, and committed for so-called sport, as Loving himself described, sparked outrage in the military and the public. Authorities arrested Loving the following day. During interrogation, he confessed in detail, even reenacting the murders for investigators and showing no visible remorse. In 1989, Loving was court-martialed and convicted on 2 counts of premeditated murder and 1 count of attempted murder. The trial included chilling testimony, including that from the surviving victim and footage of Loving's confession. The court-martial panel sentenced him to death, a rare penalty in military courts. He was one of only a handful of U.S. service members to receive a military death sentence since the reinstatement of capital punishment. For nearly 3 decades, Loving remained on military death row at the United States Disciplinary Barracks in Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. His case went through numerous appeals, all of which upheld the conviction and sentence. In the years that followed, debates emerged around the fairness of the military death penalty and whether race, youth, or mental state had played a role in his sentencing. Then, in one of his final acts as president, Barack Obama commuted Loving's sentence on January 17, 2017, just 3 days before leaving office. The death sentence was reduced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. This decision was part of a broader wave of clemency efforts during Obama's presidency, but it stirred controversy given the particularly heinous nature of Loving's crimes. Case 7. Sergeant Malik Kearney, the murder of Carlin Ramirez. Sergeant Malik Kearney appeared to many as a disciplined and capable U.S. Army soldier stationed at Fort Jackson, South Carolina. But beneath the uniform and rank, he was a man consumed by jealousy, control, and a dangerous obsession. His descent into darkness would ultimately cost a young mother her life and send shockwaves through the military community. The victim was his estranged wife, Private First Class Carlin Ramirez, a 24-year-old soldier stationed at Fort Meade, Maryland. She was a promising and well-liked service member, described by friends and colleagues as intelligent, driven, and deeply devoted to her infant daughter. Her marriage to Kearney, however, had grown increasingly volatile. Ramirez had reported domestic abuse and had recently filed a restraining order, initiating the process of separation. But Kearney was not willing to let go. On August 24, 2015, he made a chilling decision. He left his base in South Carolina and drove over 500 miles to Maryland, crossing state lines with a single purpose: to kill his wife. Under cover of darkness, Kearney used a spare key to enter Ramirez's townhouse in Severn, Maryland. Inside, he found her alone with their 4-month-old daughter. As Ramirez stood defenseless, Kearney drew a firearm and shot her 3 times at close range, execution style. Her body was discovered the following day, lying on the floor with her baby cradled in her arms, miraculously unharmed but helpless beside her mother's lifeless form. To investigators, the crime scene was horrific and suspicious. Kearney had attempted to stage it to look like a sexual assault, a distraction meant to obscure his involvement. But the forensic evidence didn't align. Surveillance footage, GPS data, and digital records began to paint a clear picture of a calculated, premeditated murder. Making the case even more disturbing was the role played by Kearney's mistress, Dolores Delgado, a civilian living in Florida. Investigators uncovered that Delgado had helped plan the crime. She provided the murder weapon, a .357 revolver, and allowed Kearney to borrow her car to make the trip. She also stayed behind in South Carolina to create a false alibi, using Kearney's phone to send misleading texts and location pings that would suggest he never left the area. After the murder, she assisted him in disposing of the weapon and other incriminating materials. The deception unraveled quickly. Authorities arrested both Kearney and Delgado. In court, Kearney's cold planning and lack of remorse became central to the prosecution's argument. The most haunting moment came when the jury was shown how, after killing his wife, Kearney had placed the baby back into her mother's arms before fleeing the scene, an image that would sear itself into the minds of everyone involved. Kearney was charged with interstate travel to commit domestic violence resulting in death and use of a firearm in a crime of violence. Following an 11-day federal trial, the jury found him guilty. In 2018 he was sentenced to life in federal prison without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 10 years. His accomplice, Dolores Delgado, pleaded guilty to conspiracy to commit murder and received a 17-year sentence in federal prison. She later testified against Kearney, expressing regret, but the damage had already been done. The murder of Carlin Ramirez was more than just a case of domestic violence. It was a wake-up call to the military about the dangers of abuse within its own ranks. It highlighted systemic failures to protect service members from intimate partner violence, even when they take steps to seek help. Ramirez, a young mother and rising soldier, did everything she could to escape a dangerous relationship. But despite her efforts, the system failed her. Today, Malik Kearney remains behind bars for life. His actions left a daughter without a mother, a family shattered, and a military community still reckoning with the consequences of ignoring red flags. The legacy of Carlin Ramirez serves as both a tragedy and a powerful reminder. The threat to our heroes doesn't always come from the battlefield, it can come from within. These are not just stories, they are the grim truths buried beneath uniforms, ranks, and silence. If you believe these stories deserve to be seen, heard, and never forgotten, subscribe to this channel now. Hit the like button to support content that uncovers the brutal reality behind the headlines. And turn on the notification bell so you're the first to witness the next chilling account we uncover. This is War Behind the War. And we're just getting started.